Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about how to make a proper unit transition in Age of Empires 2. Now a lot of people have the wrong idea when thinking about unit transitions, and there are a lot of very common mistakes that tend to occur when people try to go for such a thing. Unit transitions are like making a U-turn when driving. Sometimes you really have to make one, but you have to find the right time to do so because there are a lot of signs that say no U-turn, and even when there's a sign that says no U-turn, you can still do it as long as you don't get caught by the cops or cause any kind of traffic havoc. Obviously this is not a good idea, but that's how it works in Age of Empires 2. Sometimes people do the wrong thing, but they get away with it, so they never really learn, what the right way to do it is. So hopefully in this video, I can teach you guys the right way to make a unit transition and give you guys some tips so you can avoid the cops in your own games. Sorry. I can give you guys some tips so you can definitely have, the right kind of mindset when thinking about this for your own games. Alright, before diving too deep into that, we have to first establish why you would need to transition into different units in the first place. Why can't the one unit just be enough most of the time? Obviously, it's quite a simple concept, but I figured I'd cover it just in case we have new viewers on the channel that are new to RTS or to Age of Empires 2 in general. So as I said, it's quite simple really. You start out by making the unit you want to make at the start of the game, and it's usually the one that you want to make as a player or that your civilization excels at, and it's usually the natural choice for you in any particular game. And then naturally, your opponent will go ahead and counter the unit that you have on the field, because in Age of Empires 2, some units perform better against others. So if you open the game with Magyar scouts, a very logical choice, your opponent will tend to overproduce or produce a few spearmen to try to counter you. And then based on him making spearmen, I then, after opening scouts, will need to transition into a different unit, because long-term scouts aren't going to really cut it against mass spearmen, and so I might choose to go for something like a skirmisher or an archer to counter that spearman. Think of it like an endless game of rock, paper, scissors, where I'm going for one thing, my opponent goes ahead and counters me, but then I can then counter his counter, and then the move is up to him. It continues going in a loop. However, as it progresses, it gets more and more complicated. After the initial countering, I have one unit, he counters it, we both have one unit, and then I add a second unit, and all of a sudden I've got two different units creating a composition. Some compositions work in complete harmony when you have one range unit, one melee unit working perfectly together, and then other compositions are a little bit more clunky, having two melee units, having some units that are really slow mixed in with some units that are really fast, not really able to work together properly, and so on and so forth. It gets really complicated. There are a ton of factors, but the idea at the base level is quite simple. We're always trying to counter what our opponent has on the field in order to get favorable trades on the combat side of things. Alright, so back to how to actually make a unit transition. Now, normally when I'm watching games or doing coaching, or even in my high-level games, there's usually 3 common mistakes. And honestly, I'm not excluding myself from this list. I always make these mistakes. In fact, it's one of the hardest things that I had to learn as a player when I was a filthy 2K player playing up against the pros like Doubt, and I'd always lose because I'm making the wrong choices or just being way too stubborn about it. So these 3 mistakes, I've made them all, but let me know down below which ones you make the most. Alright, so the first of the 3 mistakes is this. It's one type of player who is way too stubborn and stays on his one unit for way too long, allowing himself to get easily countered. Even after he sees the counter unit from his opponent, he will continue making his initial unit thinking he can outplay his opponent, but unfortunately he usually fails in doing so. And the keyword here is usually, because sometimes this could work, and so what I'd say is that there's a time and a place for this approach, but it's not a good rule of thumb. It's not something you should do all the time. And this is something I was guilty of doing all the time when, again, I was up and coming and just trying to learn the game at the highest level. Definitely one that we need to work our mind away from, because it's not a good long-term plan over hundreds of games. The second type of mistake or type of personality when it comes to unit transitions is the one who rushes all kinds of different units right away, all kinds of transitions all over the place. They don't even know if they can afford it or not. They typically end up with 3 or 4 different units, creating a chaotic composition of unupgraded units that are impossible to manage, and honestly, that composition is quite ineffective. This guy just creates a massive mess and no one can control it, and he doesn't even know where it went wrong. And the third type of mistake is the one who has the perfect timing on the transition, but unfortunately just goes for the wrong unit and dies anyway. Quite sad, I know, but that's the way it goes sometimes. Alright, with all that out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and cover all of these problems and provide solutions for you, and hopefully by the end of the video, you'll know how to make a proper unit transition, what to look for, what to go for, and precisely how to go about it so it's a smooth transition and there's no points in it where you're vulnerable to any kind of opponent's aggression or timing. Alright, so the first thing to consider is when you need to transition. Usually you do this when you find yourself in an unfavorable position. For example, you have knights, and long term it's not a great option versus cavalry archers. This is a soft counter. Cav archers don't completely shred knights, and it's not an emergency situation. So when you find yourself in this position, normally the knights can perform pretty decently in the short term, but when the cavalry archers get massed, that's when it becomes a problem. In this case, we usually plan for a long-term transition, and we have a few minutes to work on that because our current situation isn't a disaster. So in this situation, we'll tend to a few tactics. For the second situation, this is where your opponent has an outright counter unit. In this situation, the clock is really ticking. We have to be a little bit faster in finding a transition, and sometimes we have to do a couple steps before finding our long-term transition, and I'll go ahead and cover what those steps should and could be. So for example, this would be knights versus camels. I opened with knights, my opponent just goes for camels, and it's okay for a little bit, but very quickly camels will become a massive problem if I'm playing only knights. And so it's my responsibility to find a pretty good solution for it rather quickly. Another option is knights versus pikes. Shout out Nilly. Pikes long term versus knights will trade cost effectively, and me as a knight player might be fine in the short term, but definitely have to find a solution to those pikes in the long term. So as you can see from these basic examples, as soon as you see the enemy counter unit, you're not usually in a disastrous situation or an emergency that you need to find a transition within like a few seconds. At the very least, you'd have a couple minutes of time to get ready and pick what you want to go for. However, as you guys may know from playing the game, a couple minutes in game time really isn't that long. And so I want to stress that you have some time, but it's really not that much time that you can be casual about it. We have to take a few steps to buy us usually a bit more time and really plan ahead as to what the counter should and could be. The reason I'm saying should and could is that usually there's a couple options that you can go for. So it's not like I see my opponent going for X unit and it's very obvious what I have to make. Usually you have a few options. So it's like, okay, you could do this, you could do this, you could do that. Now, what should you do in your current situation? And so I really want to highlight that it's a very nuanced thought process, and it's not very black and white where if he does this, I do that. And it's basically a mathematical equation. It's not really how the game works, unfortunately. It would be really easy if it was. So now that we got a feel for how the timing is laid out, some unfavorable matchups usually have a few minutes, and then when it's a counter unit, usually have a couple minutes in game. Now let's see what to do when we're actually in these situations. What's the practical approach to going about it? So regardless what situation you find yourself in, there's usually an immediate transition that you can make that's gonna buy you time to make your long-term transition. But your long-term transition has to be the proper solution. That's the one you're aiming for, and that's the one that's going to try to win you the game. The short-term solution is usually there to buy you some time or to force your opponent to respect you a little bit and not just look to trade all over the place with this counter unit. The reason why we need to buy ourselves time is that the long-term transition just takes too long to get going. I'll go ahead and explain what I mean by short-term and long-term transitions very soon, but I need you guys to understand that we need to buy ourselves time, and that's the reason why the short-term transition is even relevant. Otherwise, if I can just pick whatever I want, I'd almost always choose the long-term transition, and when I reveal what these terms are referring to, it'd be very clear to you as well, and you'd obviously agree with me. So once again, we need to buy ourselves time, and that's why the short-term transition exists in the first place. All right, now the moment we've been waiting for, enough waffling around, let's go ahead and talk about these terms. So when it comes to short-term transitions, I'm referring to mainly in Castle Age, Monastery, Siege Workshop, and University. These three buildings give us a ton of options that can help with our composition building and help kind of buffer into our proper long-term transition. Other options are defensive structures like walls, towers, and castles, and these, especially in Feudal Age, can be very effective. Palisade walls and houses can buy you a ton of time and allow for proper transitions. Let me give you guys a couple examples so you can truly understand what I mean by a short-term transition and why it's important. So for example, if I open with knights and my opponent is on camels, I want to get to pikes, but pikes is a long-term transition. Why? Because it requires an extra couple barracks. I only have one barracks initially. I need to make one or two more to get some production rolling. I also need the pikeman upgrade. I need squires most of the time, and then any blacksmith upgrades. And then I actually have to mass the unit. One or two pikes are not very effective. As you can see, that is a ton of resources. But although pikes are great against camels, I can't justify just randomly adding in pikes as soon as I see enemy camels. So what I would actually do in a real game situation is that I'd open with a monastery. Monastery is really quick to get to, and the monks counter the camels in the short term. Monastery, 175 wood, one or two monks, that's 100 or 200 gold, and those monks will help turn the tide when the units are like 6v6 or 8v8. The two conversions completely swing the tide of the fights and give me the advantage. So even though my opponent has the counter units, I'm currently with this small transition, short-term transition, composition, I'm currently still in control of the game, and I've got the more powerful unit and the defensive unit to guard against the camels, and I've got that little composition that works wonders at controlling the mid game. And then from this position, I can use the window that I've bought myself with the monks to then set up the pike transition, which is naturally more expensive. This allows me to do a very controlled pike transition. My opponent doesn't know it's coming, how strong it is, how fast it's going to hit him, and then I put him on the ropes because he's going to continue massing camels, seeing that I'm still on knights, and then once he's built up a ton of camels, my economy is going to be pretty strong back home. He's got 20, I've got 20 knights, and then bam, all of a sudden I switch to pikes with a stronger economy. I still have the monks, and my composition is way stronger than him, and now it's up to him to find a counter unit to my pikes, monks, and knights composition. This is exactly how it works in any scenario. I can pick anything. Expo versus skirm. I want to go for knights, but knights are expensive. What do? I make a siege workshop, couple mangonels and scorpions. All of a sudden, I have an answer to these skirmishers. And so as you can see, the monastery, the siege workshop, and to some extent the university with like guard tower and ballistics and whatnot, these act as short-term transitions. They're going to turn the tides of the early game fights or early cast fights in your favor without forcing you to go for a completely different unit type, which takes a lot of resources and a ton of time to mass. The reason why we still need the long-term transition though is that usually these short-term options are not favorable in the long run. Monks are really easy to control when you have 3 or 4 of them. If you've got 20 monks, I'm not an AI, I can't control 20 monks at the same time. It's really difficult, and so 20 monks are really not that effective in the hands of a human because you have to control them all manually, and it's quite difficult to do so. And so as you can see, monks are great in the short term, terrible in the long run, and so I'm only using them in the short term to prepare something else in the long run, and that is the perfect harmony. That is the perfect way to make a unit transition. Now, to give you guys a couple more examples in different ages, for example, the feudal age, again, it's the same concept, except I don't have access to monasteries and siege workshop, but what I do have access to is walls. And so if I'm going archers, my opponent goes skirms, ain't no problem. I could go for scouts, that's not bad, but again, scouts tends to be a little bit more the long-term transition. So in the short term, what I'll do is I'll probably just make a few walls. Those take a minute to build up with a few villas. I'm naturally walling with houses, and so usually I'm good to go. If it gets messy, I also have a tower available to me, and that could be a good short-term transition to buy myself time, and then eventually the scouts can come up if I still need them. Another form of a long-term transition can be an age up. So if I'm feudal age, I buy myself time with the houses, and then my transition from archers to something else, it'll just be archers into castle age. And then when I get the crossbows counter feudal age skirms. The feudal age skirms really can't compete if you've got decent micro. And so as you can see in this example, the short-term transition was the walls, long-term transition was the expo. This method of thinking when it comes to unit transitions is so good, and I'm sure if your opponent isn't doing this, he's gonna fall behind in crucial decision-making aspects. When it comes to this buzzword decision-making that every 900 ELO throws in Twitch chats, but no one really understands what it means, this is the kind of things that pros are referring to. These are the decisions we're making constantly, but the better and more experienced you are, the more obvious it becomes for you. If you're a beginner or a new player or an up-and-coming player, it's very hard to understand these patterns and to recognize them in your own games, but hopefully after videos like these, you can start to recognize these patterns and these methods of thinking that can help you make better decisions on your own. There are so many different variables that I can't sit here and give an example for every single situation. So instead, what I'll do is that I'll leave you with a couple more rules of thumb that you can use to make the right choices in your games. So when it comes to picking the right units, try to choose a unit that complements the one that you initially had. A general rule of thumb is that range units work really well with a melee unit. So one range unit, one melee unit. Another way is one gold unit, so one gold heavy unit, and the other unit that comes in is a trash unit. This is a great way to think about your composition because usually these types of units cover each other's weaknesses. For example, archers in the back, knights in the front, you're looking at a very solid composition and what we see in every team game. If you combine this with whatever short-term transition you make, you're looking at a very fierce composition and a very strong army. For example, if I've got crossbows and then I've also got a couple mangonels because my opponent's on skirms, and then I switch into knights, how does my opponent stop crossbows, mangonels, and knights? All of a sudden, I've got this beautiful composition that can easily defend whatever he has and then launch a massive push against him, force him to then make a strong transition or else he's going to lose the game. And so as you can see, mixing in units that work really well together but doing it at the right time is obviously a skill that will get developed as you play hundreds of games, but it is definitely a skill that you need to hone from now and hopefully build up because this is the way to win games without any fancy micro. Hopefully you guys enjoy these videos. I really put a lot of effort into this one in particular because it's such an important topic. If you guys want to help me out and reward the kind of effort I'm putting in, which I hope you guys can benefit from it, just leave a like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me out a ton and it keeps me motivated to put in as much time and effort into this. This one took me a couple hours to write up and to make, so I really hope you guys appreciate it and benefit from it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.